Hello. In this video, we're going to talk about Ayer and the meaninglessness of religious discourse. So here's AJ when he was a younger man. He lived, as it says down there, from 1910 to 1989. And this is a more classic picture of him when he was a little bit older. So AJ stands for Alfred Julius Ayer. And you'll also notice the Sir there. He was in fact knighted, as we'll see here in a moment. He's known for his part in the philosophical movement that's called logical positivism. And he wrote the books Language, Truth, and Logic in 1936 and The Problem of Knowledge in 1956. Language, Truth, and Logic he wrote when he was 26 years old, and it was a huge deal when the book was released. And as we can gather from the Sir in front of his name, he was knighted in 1970. And he's also known for being a figure in the humanism movement. Okay, so the strategy for today is going to be a little bit different than in previous videos. So previously I've worked through the text and drawn out the argument. This time I'm going to present the argument, and then we're going to work through each of the premises. So I will start by presenting Ayer's argument. Then I'm going to explain each of the premises in detail. This should provide the necessary background to make sense of each of the premises and hopefully make the argument make sense. For this week, the second reading that I've included, which is called Is the Existence of God Testable by Elliot Sober, may be particularly helpful for making sense of Ayer's view. However, I want you to be aware that Sober's not simply rehearsing Ayer's view, he's also presenting his own. So that's something important to keep in mind. Ayer's view and Sober's view are not the same. Okay, so let's start with Ayer's argument. The first premise. In order for the proposition God exists to be meaningful, it must follow from either an a priori argument or an a posteriori argument. Now, if you don't know what those words mean, don't worry, we're about to cover them. The second premise, the proposition God exists cannot follow from an a priori argument. Okay. The third premise, the proposition God exists cannot follow from an a posteriori argument. So, we end up with a conclusion, the proposition God exists is meaningless. Okay, just like the title of the video suggested. However, I want you to note here that saying something is meaningless is not the same as saying that God exists is false. I'll expand on that a little bit later in the video. Okay, what is an a priori argument? Well, an a priori argument is an argument that follows from reason alone. So, Anselm's ontological argument is an example of an a priori argument. And notice that in Anselm's argument, it didn't require anything other than the definition of God in order to show that God exists, right? So it's just following from reason alone. Now, something that's important to keep in mind about a priori arguments are that their conclusions are certain rather than probable. This will come up very soon. So, why is the proposition God exists? Why can it not follow from an a priori argument? Okay, so this is according to Ayer. So according to Ayer, although the conclusions of an a priori argument are certain, if there's any uncertainty in the argument's premises, then this uncertainty is transferred to the argument's conclusion. This seems reasonable, right? If you remember back to the first week of class, your argument is only as good as your premises. So any uncertainty in your premises is transferred to the conclusion in an a priori argument. Okay? Well, none of the premises in any of the a priori arguments for the existence of God are certain. So because of that, none of the conclusions of a priori arguments for the existence of God are certain. So if you kind of want to check this out to see what this means, you can look back at Anselm's argument and ask yourself if you think that all of the premises in that argument are certain. If you don't, then you can kind of see the point that Ayer is making here. Okay? All right. So, back to the argument. Check. We understand the second premise now. All right. Moving on to the third. What is an a posteriori argument? An a posteriori argument is an argument that follows from facts about experience in the world. So an example of this kind of argument is Aquinas' cosmological argument. All right? So notice that a posteriori arguments rely on empirical hypotheses or claims about how the world is. And then also notice that because they require these hypotheses can be tested. Following from this, the conclusions of a priori arguments are only probable and not certain. All right. So, why does the proposition God exists not follow from an a posteriori argument? A posteriori arguments, as I said, use empirical hypotheses, and empirical hypotheses are only probably true. Okay, what does this even mean? Well, here we go. Here's an example of a classic a posteriori argument. Premise 1, all swans are white. That animal is a swan, so that animal is white, right? And the empirical hypothesis here that is in the center of the argument is the claim that all swans are white. But notice that this is only probably true, okay? So a single black swan will show that this argument, as it's written, is false. So a more reasonable version of this argument would be something like this, right? Most swans are white. That animal is a swan. So that animal is probably white, right? But notice that this isn't certain. It's only probably true that the animal is white. Okay? All right. So notice that if the existence of God were probable, then the proposition God exists would be an empirical hypothesis. Okay? However, empirical hypotheses can be shown to be false, as I just said a little earlier, but it will turn out, as we'll soon see, that God exists cannot be shown to be false. Now notice that when I say that it cannot be shown to be false, this will turn out not to mean the same thing as proving that it's true. Yeah, but you'll see what I'm talking about here in just a moment. Okay, so what does it mean to be able to be shown to be false? So what I mean when I say this is that there needs to be some kind of measurable phenomenon that a person could experience that would show that the hypothesis is false. Okay? However, in the case of God, there doesn't seem to be any measurable phenomenon that everyone would accept to show that the hypothesis God exists is false. Okay? So, what am I talking about? So, here's an example. You might think that the existence of evil in the world shows that the hypothesis God exists is false, right? So the idea is you can point to evil in the world, and that has to be something that proves that God doesn't exist, right? But notice that theists don't believe that the existence of evil in the world falsifies the hypothesis God exists, right? Instead, they might say, for example, that the evil in the world is all part of God's plan. So the point of having a hypothesis is the fact that you can show that it's sometimes wrong, right? This is how you test your hypothesis. You're testing your hypothesis, and what it means to test it is that it can either be right or wrong. But the claim here is that the idea that the claim God exists can't be shown to be false. Okay. So, because the proposition God exists can't be shown to be false, this means that the proposition God exists isn't an empirical hypothesis. Remember? So empirical hypotheses need to be able to be shown that they're false, and the proposition God exists can't be shown to be false. Okay. So the proposition God exists can't follow from an a posteriori argument. All right? So, according to Ayer, this means that the proposition that God exists is meaningless. So we'll go through the argument again. In order for the proposition God exists to be meaningful, it must follow from either an a priori argument or from an a posteriori argument. 2. The proposition God exists cannot follow from an a priori argument. 3. The proposition God exists cannot follow from an a posteriori argument. And so, the proposition God exists is meaningless. All right, now we've gone through the second premise, and I've expanded on that. And we've gone through the third premise. So, what does this proposition what does it mean to say that the proposition that God exists is meaningless? So you'll remember early in the video, I said that it's important to remember that this isn't the same as saying that God exists is false. Okay, so what does it even mean for a proposition to be meaningless? According to Ayer, a meaningless proposition isn't true, but it also isn't false. Instead, when you use a meaningless proposition, you aren't saying anything at all about the world. So, all utterances about the nature of God are nonsensical. They can't be used in meaningful propositions at all, right? You could just imagine it'd be like the same as making some strange sound, right? So, it's like saying the proposition God exists is like, you know, that seems to be a meaningless sound. And the claim is that all utterances like this about the nature of God are nonsensical. They can't be used in meaningful propositions at all. All right. So I'm going to go through Ayer's argument one last time to conclude. In order for the proposition God exists to be meaningful, it must follow from either an a priori argument or from an a posteriori argument. The proposition God exists cannot follow from an a priori argument. The proposition God exists cannot follow from an a posteriori argument. And so, the proposition God exists is meaningless.